Hello, everyone. Welcome to Amplifying Voices, NC2ML's We All Speak Math podcast, where we take a deep dive into the power of dialogue and mathematics education. I'm Josh Griffin.
I'm Emily Hare.
And I'm Margaret Borton. This podcast is part of the statewide We All Speak Math campaign from the NC Collaborative of Mathematics Learning, dedicated to enhancing student discourse in the classroom. With us today is Mandy Jansen and Emily Myers.
So today's episode, we're focusing on one of our discourse moves from our We All Speak Math campaign called Encouraging in Progress Thinking, and what we can learn from Mandy Jansen's work with rough draft math. I think what I really loved about the conversation was how often we kept talking about all of the discourse moves. We weren't just talking about in progress or encouraging in progress thinking, but we kept talking about how different moves related to that and how you could use all of them in tandem.
Yeah, Emily, it's fun to watch how all of those discourse moves are kind of correlated. I love the idea of taking a rough draft idea that you've typically seen in ELA and applying it to mathematics. I don't understand why there's always pressure to share complete, finished thoughts in math. I think we should normalize sharing our rough draft strategies and thinking.
Yeah, totally. I think it was cool to hear also how rough drafts make a mathematics classroom welcoming and inclusive. Plus, we learned that this concept of rough draft math was developed from a group of current practicing teachers she was working with who thought everyone would resonate with the idea of a rough draft. So very cool.
Well, you are in for an enriching discussion. So without further ado, let's dive into today's episode of Amplifying Voices, NC2ML's We All Speak Math podcast.
Welcome to the We All Speak Math podcast. We're so happy to have Dr. Mandy Jansen with us today, as well as our North Carolina guest, Emily Myers. Mandy, would you introduce yourself and tell us about your current role and the path that led you to this work we're doing today?
Sure, thanks. It's nice to be here. So my name is Mandy Jansen, and my current role is I'm a professor at the University of Delaware. I work in the School of Education, and I have a joint appointment in our math department. So what that means basically is I teach undergrads who are studying to be teachers, and specifically elementary and middle school teachers, and I conduct research in schools. And before that, I was a middle school teacher in the Phoenix area in Arizona. And then I went to graduate school at Michigan State University. And now I have my current position, which I love, being a math educator. And I facilitate professional development with current teachers and service teachers as well. But when I facilitate professional development, I really look at it as creating a collaborative learning space where we're all learning from each other.
I love that.
Mandy's leaving out all of her work with NCTM and MTBOS and all of the Twitter world. So Mandy, I just love how connected you are to the community via those platforms. And it's been really helpful to get to know you through that as well. So I thank you for all of your work in that sphere of our work.
Oh, thank you so much. I think we all learn through dialogue and collaboration. And so the Twitter/X, that's been a great dialogue space. And I was really fortunate to be able to visit University of North Carolina, Greensboro, right before COVID happened. I visited your university in February, late February 2020. It was one of my last trips before COVID.
Yeah, I remember
that. No idea what was coming, right?
We did. And I remember the two of us were at lunch and we were talking about how excited I was because I was about to present for the first time at the national conference. And you're like, oh, it's going to be great. And then I remember us saying, have you heard about the COVID thing? I wonder if that's going to impact the conference. Little did we know, right?
Little did we know. And now we're Zoom experts.
Exactly. And we can do things like this, right? I do feel like that's opened a lot of possibilities for us to connect more frequently on virtual spaces than we used to. So
definitely.
Silver lining.
Awesome. And Emily M, we have here today. What would you introduce yourself and tell us about your current role and the path that led you to the work we're doing today?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me on today. So I am the senior math specialist with the North Carolina Center for the Advancement of Teaching, which some of you guys may know as NCAT. So before joining NCAT, my background was really teaching middle school and high school math in North Carolina before becoming a math specialist working in the K-12 world. And then right before joining NCAT, I was also the director of curriculum and instruction for secondary education. So doing all of that kind of led me to my current role where I get to really just work with teachers and work with students across North Carolina, really just engaging in high quality, authentic professional learning and learning alongside as a collaborator, just in that space.
Very cool.
Emily Myers, do you want to give a shout out to a certain district, or you want to leave it anonymous?
So I taught in New Hanover County schools,
Yeah.
and then I worked in Beaufort County schools as well.
Two great places to be, I'm sure.
Yeah, Eastern North Carolina girl.
That's where the beach is at. Best place to be. Not biased at all. So this podcast is focused on the discourse move we call encouraging in-process thinking. Emily Myers, not Hare, Myers. I know this is one of your favorites. Can you tell us why it's so meaningful to you?
Absolutely. So I am a total math nerd, but I also have had the opportunity to work with other content areas as well. So before joining NCAT, I got to work a lot with literacy. And something that I noticed in kind of the literacy world is this idea of having a rough draft, thinking about writing. You know, if we're writing a paper, we write a rough draft and then we revise it, and it's constantly in that revision stage. And what that really made me start thinking about is why do we have this kind of fixed mindset about math, where math, we do it once and we're done? So that's what really kind of hit me or hooked me on this idea of rough draft math or in progress thinking was, oh my gosh, what a great thing to like instill in ourselves as mathematicians, but also our students, where it's okay to be in progress. Like it's okay to have a rough draft with the math that you're doing. It doesn't have to be final yet. So I think that's really what has hooked me with some of the work and why it's one of my favorite moves.
It's so funny too, because like it's typical in a literacy classroom or like an ELA to be like, oh, this is your rough draft. Like, why hasn't that been a thing in math spheres for so long? So I agree, Emily, completely.
Yeah, I love the power of yet, right?
Yes.
Yet. Mandy, what about you?
So I really value rough drafts and revising in math class because I think so many of us have had experiences as learners, or we also know people who've had experiences as learners where we try and then we're told all the time that this is incorrect or it's got so many problems. And instead, it is also the case that the work that we're doing has strengths that can be built from. It's discouraging to be told all the time how incorrect your work is. But really, the way we learn anything is through trying things out, getting perspectives from other people, continually improving. And so I think it's really useful to treat learning as just let's get our initial ideas out, assume there's value in your ideas and that other people's thinking makes sense. We can then compare and contrast how we're currently thinking about it, and then see how we can develop a new idea together by trying to understand one another and assuming other people's ideas make sense to them. I think that this can like lower the barrier of entry into the math discourse if anybody's in progress thinking is assumed to have value. And, you know, we just learn through puzzling through things. So why not honor that process more explicitly in the math classroom?
I love this idea of assuming the best in someone's work and in what they're trying to do, because you're right. Like, who am I to say that what you did doesn't make sense to you? Right now, it may not make sense to me. So let me try to understand what it was that you were doing so that we can start to understand each other. And I can try to explain and connect mine to what you're doing. And we can connect it to what other people are doing outside of the class. And then you can start bringing in some of those mathematical conventions, even like as a space to say, oh, so this is connected to that. I think that it's really powerful what you're saying, this It's often described as strength-based, but I think it's even more than that. The assumption that this has value, and we are finding that value and making connections to it outside. Thank you for articulating it that way. How cool.
Oh, I appreciate that. Yeah, I had to make a big move as an educator to bracket the process of evaluating, kind of set that to the side and focus on trying to understand people first. Because sometimes, like you said, Margaret, that we may think something doesn't make sense, but it just doesn't make sense to the listener yet. And if we orient ourselves to assume that we have more to understand as the educator or facilitator, then everyone is valued in a different way. And then we keep learning as educators and teachers, which is rejuvenating and exciting.
Absolutely. So listeners, if you haven't figured this out already, we have the expert on encouraging in progress thinking here today. Mandy's research is where this move comes from. So Mandy, could you tell us more about your work with rough draft math? We've been referencing it, and how you conceptualize this move.
Yeah, so I would like to first say that I don't personally view myself as the owner of this idea. I view myself as a curator and able to amplify brilliance in teachers. So rough drafts math. So first it comes from, if you want to go way back, researchers in classroom discourse such as Douglas Barnes, Neil Mercer, talk about a concept called exploratory talk, or they write about the concept of exploratory talk. And when they define that, where you're using talk to explore ideas, they contrast that with talking to perform. Like, I'm going to present something that I've figured out. That's more of a final draft. And I was facilitating a study group of secondary math teachers in Delaware. And we were reading about exploratory talk. And some of the teachers in the study group said, if exploratory talk contrasts with final draft talk, then maybe it would make more sense to call the exploratory talk rough draft talk. When we're talking with students, that might make more sense to students than exploratory talk. So the teachers in the study group offered to shift the term to rough drafts in math class. And that ended up being very generative for all of us, because then we started to explore ourselves. What would it look like if we incorporated rough drafts into math class? And so teachers take this idea and then they generate instructional practices that seem to align with drafting. And then we don't want to remain in the rough draft stage. So then revising gets incorporated into that. So everything that I know about rough drafts and revising has come from a classroom teacher thinking about what this might look like in their classroom. And I really view myself as a curator of the brilliant ideas of classroom teachers. So this is about, rough draft math is about creating a culture where everyone's ideas at any stage are welcome and encouraged, orienting us so we're all learning from each other, including teachers learning from students, that we start from our current thinking, we start with whatever makes sense to us, and then everyone is constantly improving and revising. Revision opportunities are explicitly encouraged, and we're not positioning people as either correct or incorrect. It's okay, what can we revise next? Because even if you have a correct solution, you can keep revising by making a new connection, maybe representing your thinking with a different visual, maybe layering in an additional strategy that you weren't using before. Maybe it's taking your proof and making it more elegant, even if it's a correct logical proof, right? So we can all keep leveling up or improving our thinking. And that way it's not positioning some people as you have it and you don't. We are all continually growing. So that's a little bit about some of the history of rough draft math and how I think about it.
Mandy, there's several things that I think we can go from there, but I also heard something in the midst of that around the power of research practice partnerships.
Mm,
and
yes.
around getting multiple perspectives. I know that's not where you were going, but I heard that snippet in there and I couldn't help but to note that because it really makes me think about the work we've been doing with NC2ML, right? And bringing multiple perspectives to the table. And it's not just about what the researchers bring, and it's not just about what the teachers bring or the district leaders or the coaches, but it's about the power of what happens when all of us are in those spaces together and thinking through things together and are connecting to all of our roles and how powerful that can be. Just look at the rough draft math movement, right? And the power that's come from that because of the cross conversations between multiple roles that are passionate and interested in math.
And that's a really helpful connection, Emily. I think that one reason why rough drafts in math class resonate with so many folks is that it came from classroom practitioners, teachers doing the work. And so then it resonates with other teachers. And then also, if we want to create math classrooms where students all experience that their thinking is valuable, what if we haven't experienced that ourselves? As leaders, professionals, teachers, right? So if we create research practice partnerships where everyone in the room has something valuable to offer, and then we learn something new together, then we understand what that feels like as learners ourselves. And then it's something that we can more readily create with other people once we've experienced that. So absolutely. I think research practice partnerships are so valuable. I am always so thankful that folks are willing to learn alongside with me and I can learn from them in partnerships. Yes.
Speaking of partnerships, Emily Myers, you mentioned using rough draft math in your work. Could you share about how you use it and some special considerations educators should think about when they use this move?
Absolutely. And I want to kind of tag on to some of the things that Mandy talked about that I think are so important. And it's this idea that teachers need the experience to have something to connect back to. So I have such a unique job in the fact that I get to work with practitioners across the state, but I also get to go in and work with students. So I am all the time in classrooms from kindergarten through 12th grade. And I have started really using this idea of rough draft math, whether I'm working with students or I'm working with teachers. So I have also not made it the focus of my trainings. What I've done instead is naturally incorporated it into the work because what I want teachers to realize is it becomes a natural part of your practice. So, for example, I was doing a training recently on the capturing quantities routine, and I asked teachers to create a model or a representation to like really show their thinking for a problem that we were working on. And I paused them intentionally before they were able to finish their models. And the teachers looked at me like I had 10 heads, and they're like, we are not done yet. And it just shows the culture that we have as humans where we feel the need to be done before we share our thinking. And what I do, whether I'm working with students or teachers, is I call attention to the fact that what we're doing is I'm pausing them so that they can share their in progress thinking. And it provides that natural space to talk about what in progress thinking is without doing a whole training on just in progress thinking. And teachers have come up to me afterwards and been like, oh my gosh, that was really cool to stop and share before they had a final product. I also like to ask teachers, like, why do you think, or like, what do you think the benefit of pausing students before they have a final product? And just to hear the conversations that teachers have. And it reminds me too of some of the work Peter has done in building thinking classrooms, where in that he talks about maintaining flow. And that's something that comes up every time I talk with teachers is they're like, we have to figure out a way to maintain that flow of the lesson. And at what point do we need to intentionally pause students to have them share out their thinking where we're not losing some students? Like, how do we really balance some of that? So that's just some examples of how I've really started using it in my own practice. I found that it fits very naturally into the work that I do on a daily basis.
You know what I love about what I'm hearing from both of you all is thinking about how focusing on that one kind of explicit finite move is making this more organic like discourse happen in the classroom, right? And so it's making me think about, I know this episode is focused on in progress thinking, but really all those 9 discourse moves that we have, like the point is not, okay, we're going to use revoicing right now, right? The point is we're going to learn a lot about revoicing or in progress thinking or any of the moves that we have, get really good at that. And that's going to help us get to these lofty visions that we have of these really productive, discourse rich, equitable classrooms where you're hearing from all of these voices.
And that's been a huge benefit for me, Emily, of being a part of this work, is that it's helped me learn more about each of these discourse moves so that I can be more intentional about them in my own practice. Because, yeah, after learning about them and practicing them, it does become very natural in what we do every day.
I also loved, Emily, your story, Emily Myers, about pausing them and having it incorporated into a model of something you can do with students, but not the main focus because, and then reflecting on it afterwards, because I think you positioned them to really feel, I mean, obviously they were reflecting on it later, really feel what their students would be feeling and to understand the power of rough draft math in a very experiential way rather than in a theoretical way. And so you hooked them right then and there from that feeling. And I think that's so powerful. And I think it's what we've been trying to do in our PD materials is to have teachers doing math together and then the facilitator using the move intentionally and then reflecting on it later so that teachers can understand what they were experiencing, but they're not only focused on the move itself, but rather what it feels like to have the move in the space. So that's really cool. Thank you for sharing and exemplifying that story with that example, or the move with that example.
Yeah, I like to call that move a round of rough draft sharing. So stopping people before they're done. I learned about that from she was teaching 6th grade at the time. Her name is Brandy Cooper. She's a teacher in Delaware, but she's now an administrator. And that is a beautiful move to make because I remember I used to feel like, okay, I've got to wait until all the groups are done so the groups can share out. And this one group, they're not done yet. And it was kind of overwhelming, but it's actually true that you can learn from people's thinking at any stage. And the challenge I think I find with that sometimes is that so if you're asking me to share my work before I'm finished, I have to then intentionally be able to pause to be able to then listen to somebody else's work because I'm going to be still thinking about what I'm working on. And so that has led me to think about how do we create spaces where people are both willing to share their in progress thinking, but also open to listening carefully to somebody else's thinking as well. And so talk and listening, the listening piece is something that I'm thinking a lot about too, and how to support people with that.
Yeah, it sounds a little bit like a potential answer to our next question. So
Yeah.
I'll transition us to ask from both of your perspectives, what has been the most surprising or rewarding moments in your work or research regarding rough draft math or encouraging in progress thinking?
I think that what's rewarding for me is I think when I work in the rough draft space, everything becomes, I don't know, I want to say happier. You feel as if everyone is a bit more free. If you say to everyone in the room, it's fine, your rough draft ideas are really welcome here, you feel sort of a collective relaxation kind of go through the room. Like, oh, okay. But then people don't really believe that they're welcome until their ideas are treated as if they're welcome. And so then we have to make sure that we follow up in ways that people recognize that you are trying to make sense of their thinking, you value those drafts. But just that space of we're oriented to try to appreciate each other. Your draft ideas are going to make sense to us. It's this opportunity to both learn from one another, but also really it's building these relationships because it's respect and value for one another. That's been super rewarding. It's also been really rewarding to hear about other people's ideas, like when they take this up, what they do with it, because rough drafts and revising or in progress thinking, it's just an idea. And so you can enact it in a lot of different ways. So I've been really enjoying the collective knowledge building that's come out of this. That's been really rewarding too.
And I'll echo some of those same ideas. So I think what was most surprising for me, but really shouldn't have been because I'm the same way, is how uncomfortable um, this idea of in progress thinking made students and teachers the very first time that they experienced it. But at the same time, what was most rewarding was watching their reflection and growth as they learned together and kind of co-constructed meaning. And to have people after we're done with the math task be like, oh my gosh, Emily, like, thank you so much for pausing me. They're like, I got great ideas from listening to my peers or to my colleagues. So just seeing kind of like, I'm going to call a transformation of feelings throughout it, where it does start the first time as being uncomfortable, but how can we build that space and that community and that culture where it is okay and accepted, and to know that all ideas are really welcome.
And that's awesome. I think you're right to refer to this as a journey and normalize the discomfort that can happen at first, because I think I was talking more of like what happens later is all this appreciation for one another. But for me, another part of the journey that's gone on is really thinking about revising has become such a live issue for me, the importance of incorporating revising into math class, because I think that's definitely a unique piece about rough draft math, because I think a lot of people want to create safe spaces where people take intellectual risks. But what does it mean to explicitly incorporate revising that in progress thinking is something that's become a really generative space for me to think about with teachers as well.
Yeah, I really like that. And I like Emily Myers, how you're kind of made me like teachers can get aha moments too. Like it seems like you saw a lot of those light bulb moments, and we as teachers love seeing those moments with our kids.
Let's take a short break to show off some of NC2ML's resources. Did you know our September move of the month is encouraging in progress thinking? This move is super connected to Mandy's work with rough draft math. To find these resources, just go to nc2ml.org, click on Resources, 912 High School Resources, scroll down to Resources for Discourse Moves. And then when you get to our discourse move focus for each month, you'll see a toolkit for teachers, professional developers, administrators, and a DPI webinar recording from last year.
Moving on, I would want to hear from both of you, but I'm curious what advice each of you would give to teachers who are just beginning to intentionally encourage rough drafts or in progress thinking. Mandy, do you mind sharing your thoughts first?
Sure. So I would say I'm looking down at my notes because I want to think about this, but I would say there are a couple of different ways to get started. One really productive process that I've seen teachers use is brainstorm with your students. Why don't we use rough drafts in math class? Why? What would that look like? Why would rough drafts and revising be valuable in math class? What would that look like, and how would that benefit us? And as a class, collectively generate ideas about that. And then when students are talking, you can say, okay, this is a space where I'm looking for you to just share your rough draft ideas, and use that language intentionally and explicitly with students. And then think to yourselves, what are moments where I could have students document how their thinking changed? So think about a class discussion where we're sharing out all of our draft ideas and we're talking about connections between those ideas, maybe on whatever piece of paper you're working on or on a Desmos screen, something like that. Take a minute and write down, how did your thinking evolve and change during this conversation? Maybe that's your exit ticket, something like that, like creating those moments of reflection and awareness about how their thinking changed. So I think those are some ways that you can explicitly promote this culture of in progress thinking with your students.
I love that metacognitive piece added on too, right? Like
So
it's
good.
not just about sharing your thought, but it's also about tracking how your thinking changed over time. I love that aspect.
And I think you can do this really quickly, like a 1 minute opportunity, but it honors the fact that everyone is developing and growing and evolving in their thinking, like what you were saying with the power of yet. So it really normalizes that everyone's thinking is changing.
Emily Myers, what advice would you give to a teacher just beginning this?
So, first of all, I love all the ideas that Mandy shared. I really specifically like the idea of having students kind of articulate what it could look like. And I think that's something that I may add to my practice. So, thank you for that, Mandy. My advice for really getting started is going back to what's the culture that we've set in our classrooms and how can we make sure that we have set a culture where everyone feels welcome. I have a colleague who talks about welcoming people to the math party. So like I think about that a lot. Like what are we doing as educators where we're welcoming all students to this math party where they feel welcomed, they feel comfortable with sharing their mathematics. So whether it's building community activities before we even dig into a math task, but just being intentional about building that culture in the community where it is a safe space to share your thoughts and your ideas with each other and being comfortable in that space.
I love math
That
parties.
math party idea. Yeah, Josh, you and I are both like, wow, that's so cool. Let's get in. I want to go to a math party all day, every day,
Do they have
right? Let's
snacks?
do it.
I want snacks.
Absolutely.
Count me in.
Hi.
I think it takes time to ensure that everyone knows that they truly are welcome. We can tell people that they're welcome. We can tell people that their ideas are valued, but it has to be felt and experienced and built with trust over time. And so when someone does take that intellectual risk, how does everyone in the room take that up? Do people spend time really wrestling with, oh, that makes sense to me because, or I appreciate when you brought that up, it made me think about, and just taking the time to really recognize that that welcomeness, that sense of belonging is a long-term trust building process. And, it's not easy. But yeah, I want to have a math party too.
Exactly. Mandy, that makes me think about the interplay between all of these discourse moves because I know, again, we're focusing on or encouraging in progress thinking, but I mean, that's kind of the goal of this project too. We can't do that and forget about assigning competence and attributing students strategies, right? So like you've got to follow that up. You've got to follow revoicing or encouraging in progress thinking with that assigning competence piece and attributing piece so that we're positioning every student in our classroom as a knower and doer of mathematics and someone that has something to contribute to the classroom. And so that's really important to keep in mind when we're talking about any of these moves. Yes, we can isolate them to get good at that one move. The goal is we've got to use all of them together to make sure that that's the way we're going to disrupt status and that's the way that we're going to really get to the equity piece of high quality and equitable math instruction. So that's a really important point.
Absolutely. I mean, it's genuine, right? Like we believe that everyone around us has something to teach us. And when we act out of that genuine orientation, people will know. And yeah, we want to give people feedback to revise their thinking, but that doesn't mean just pointing out what could be fixed. It means identifying the strengths that we're going to build from and the new insights we gain from learning from one another. So absolutely, super important.
Man, this is just so beautiful. So before we close, we want to connect back to our campaign. Emily Hare just did that, but for you today, with the phrasing, we all speak math. When you hear that, what does it mean to you? And Emily Myers, I'll have you go first on this one.
Absolutely. So honestly, what comes to my mind initially is that we're all math people. I think sometimes you hear people just naturally in their language say, "Oh, I'm not a math person." But y'all, we are all math people and we can all speak and talk and engage in mathematics. And Emily Hare said it earlier, but just the power of welcoming all students as doers of mathematics. And so when I think about we all speak math, just thinking about every single student is welcome to the math party, but as a doer of the mathematics.
I love that. And so since Emily Myers was keying into the all in the we all speak math, I'll talk about the speak part. So it happens to be the case that every time we try to represent our thinking, it actually moves our thinking forward. So when I try to put my thinking into words, or when I try to draw a representation to communicate to someone else, that act of creation, that act of representing is learning in progress itself. So talking through our thinking helps us learn more. So as we all speak math, we are all growing as mathematical doers and thinkers.
So thank you both for adding your thoughts today. I'm curious about what particular resources do you suggest our listeners check out, as particularly right now, as they're planning on setting up norms. It's still toward the beginning of the school year. So do you have any resources that you suggest for that, Mandy?
One of my favorite ways that we can build norms in the classroom is building on a concept called rights of the learner. Olga Torres is elementary math educator in Tucson, Arizona. And Crystal Klenek-Craig, who works in San Antonio, introduced me to Olga Torres' ideas of rights of the learner. So you can build a set of classroom rights that really communicate to students about the learning process. Like, everyone in this room has the right to be confused. That's just a normal part of learning. Everyone has the right to make mistakes. That's how learning takes place. Everyone has the right to express their thinking in ways that make sense to them using the language or representations. And so you can introduce these rights to students, and then they can build additional rights throughout the year. They can reflect on what does it look like and sound like to claim this right, or to support someone else in enacting their rights. So if you would like to know more about rights of the learner, there's resources online if you look it up, but specifically there's an article in the NCTM journal, Mathematics Teacher Learning and Teaching, in the volume 113, I think it's the 2020 volume, where Crystal and her collaborator, Roseanne Robles, they write about what this would look like in a 5th grade classroom. But I think it's really powerful to work on reflecting with students about the rights in their classroom rather than rules. And additionally, as I mentioned before, talking with students about the role of rough drafts in learning and having them brainstorm what that might be is another space of something you can explicitly discuss with students and building those norms.
So I have also become a huge fan of Rights of a Learner. I learned about it from Mandy. So it is something that I really like to do. Another one of my favorite resources is I'm all about anything where we can get to know the identity of our students. So one of my favorites is from U Cubed and some of Joe Bowler's work, but it's the "And I'm a Mathematician" activity that they have, where students get to create a poster or create something visual about who they are, and then they add "and I'm a mathematician" to it. So it's a great way to get to know who students are as people and as a mathematician. I had a teacher share with me recently where she did it with all of her students and then lined the walls outside of her classroom door. So like as you entered, you got to just see who all of her students were, and thinking about the fact that they're all mathematicians as well. So that was really cool to see.
I absolutely love both of those. That's great. Well, thank you so much to each of you for sharing your insights with us today. Mandy, how can listeners learn more about your research and connect with you, just in case you want to get that invite to that math party?
Yeah. So if people are still in the space of Twitter or X, my handle there is at Mandy Math Ed. I have my email address at the University of Delaware is my last name, JANSEN at udel.edu. And I always love to hear from people.
Emily, you're the one that's going to be sending out the invites, but just in case if someone wants to invite you to a math party, how can listeners learn more and connect with you?
Absolutely. So you can find out more about my work and all the work we're doing at NCAT at ncat.org. People can also reach out to me directly. My email is emily.myers@ncat.org. So I look forward to connecting with lots of people across North Carolina.
Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in to listen to our We All Speak Math podcast. And Mandy and Emily Myers, thank you for joining us today for this conversation. It was so wonderful to learn from you all today and to discuss all of our various experiences with this move. So thank you.